Hello, dear viewer, and welcome to the Broken Expanse. It was another long yet chilly night of nothing in the usually crime-free area of Sapporo in the Hokkaido prefecture of Japan. Detectives Akiyama-san and Tanaka-san were sat listlessly in their shared office at Sapporo Police Headquarters, discussing old case files and the news and even the latest idol group that the kids these days seem to love. Pretty much anything to keep them occupied. Well, as usual, since there was no real crimes being committed. Even at 2 a.m. Looking at his wristwatch despondently and sighing, Akiyama-san suggested they go for a drive and parole the local area, even though it wasn't technically their job, since sitting in the office for the rest of their shift was not only unproductive but mind-numbingly boring. Eager to get some fresh air if nothing else, Tanaka-san hastily agreed, and so the pair grabbed their coats and made for the car. On the way down to the ground floor, Tanaka-san mused that honestly he'd even take a ghost or Oni or Onryo sighting, anything so they actually had some work to do. As he began to quietly chuckle to himself, Akiyama-san, half bemused, looked at his partner and reminded him that even joking about such things could be considered bad luck, and that he shouldn't invite such things. Seeing Tanaka-san suddenly looking more concerned than anything, Akiyama-san himself then began to wholeheartedly laugh, joking that surely he didn't believe in such things. Tanaka-san's face relaxed once more, and the two shared a laugh together. Once on the ground floor, walking towards the side of the HQ which led to the employee car park, Tanaka-san suggested, since it was almost lunch break, the two find a nice soba joint to eat at and warm them up, before patrolling the usually freezing streets. Feeling a slight rumble in his own stomach, Akiyama-san readily agreed, and so the pair set off. About 2 minutes away from their destination, the dispatch clicks on, causing the pair to instantly pay attention, since it so rarely happened. Upon listening to the call, both detectives gazed at each other with a mix of horror and urgency before changing direction and speeding off towards the crime. You see, this wasn't just some drunk getting a little too loud at a karaoke joint. No, nothing so mundane. This sounded suspiciously like some kind of assault, or possibly even murder. Arriving at the apartment block and hurriedly exiting the car, the pair made their way up to the 5th floor to knock on the door of the apartment of the person who made the report. Timidly opening the door was a kind-looking elderly woman, who greeted the detectives before hurriedly explaining the situation. You see, apparently there was what she had assumed were a nice young couple move in next door. However, things quickly started to seem odd when the young man started working nights. Through a few conversations she'd had with the couple, she'd ascertained that they both worked at the hospital. However, due to staffing issues, they ended up asking the man if he could switch his hours to work nighttime instead, to which he'd agreed. Strangely though, knowing this, she still heard a man's voice through the wall several nights throughout the week, and after, while she was admittedly quite embarrassed to admit, curiosity got the better of her, and she'd taken to listening through the wall to see if she could figure out what was going on. She'd assumed that for one reason or another the young man had quit or lost his job, but simply hadn't brought it up in conversation. However, what she came to realize was that it wasn't her neighbor's voice after all, but various different men. She told the officers that she always thought the young woman next door was so beautiful that she could have any man that she wanted, but had just assumed that she'd happily settled down with the man she fell in love with. The truth of it, though, was that she wanted to have her cake and eat it too, so to speak, a stable home life with her partner, while also spending time, to word things politely, with many different men in the evenings. Akiyama-san believed he knew exactly what had happened, and proceeded to ask what it was that she'd heard that made her call the police. To which she'd explained that she had, as usual, heard a strange man talking next door with the young woman, but unlike other nights, had heard keys in the apartment door, then screaming and shouting, some remark about being too pretty for her own good, but it sounded threatening, then more screaming, and lastly, silence. Turning to look at each other, the detectives, without speaking, both already knew what had likely happened. Thanking the woman for her time before leaving, the two cautiously approach the next apartment, ready to knock the door. Akiyama-san notices the door is already slightly ajar. Again, looking at each other, the pair nod in agreement before slowly pushing on the door and announcing themselves. As it opens, the light from the hallway floods the scene. They see it was exactly as they'd feared. So much blood, just everywhere, with 3 bodies lifelessly adorning the room. A middle-aged yet well-kept man lay across from the bed, with multiple stab wounds in his torso, and several defensive wounds across his arms and hands. Another man, younger this time, maybe late 20s, lay in a slump with a knife sticking through his chest, a hand still clasped to the handle, clearly self-inflicted. And then a strange, long lump on the bed, covered with a blanket. They approached slowly before quickly pulling back the blood-soaked bedding. A young woman lay dead with her face slashed ear to ear, lower jaw hanging, limp across her neck, and her eyes still open, staring blankly up at the detectives. Brutally mutilated, and then likely bleeding to death. Both sigh heavily before looking away, and Akiyama-san mournfully turned to his partner, half whispering, "You might just get your Onryo after all." 10 years had passed almost to the day since that evening. The two detectives, while still partnered, had only ever spoken of the event a few times after the fact, usually only very briefly before changing the subject. That was until a few weeks ago. You see, while the preceding 10 years had returned to the relative peace aside from low-level crime that they were used to, a spate of murders had cropped up. The general consensus among the police force was that a serial killer had begun making the rounds of Sapporo's backstreets in the dead of night. However, Akiyama-san and Tanaka-san felt something was off. Serial killers usually have a preferred type, so to speak, but all of these murders seemed random, as though the killer was just picking anyone. Not only this, but there was no calling card, nothing linking the victims, and not even a trace that anyone had been there aside from the aforementioned corpses. The pair had personally scoured every inch of the crime scenes, and yet the one and only thing that they had in common was the way in which the murders were committed. You see, all of the victims had had their mouths slit, ear to ear, identical to the woman from 10 years earlier. This had understandably prompted the two detectives to take a vested interest in the case. Of course, the logical explanation was one of two things. Either this was in fact a serial killer, just an albeit unusual one, or somehow someone had witnessed the crime those 10 long years ago, and was now acting, perhaps in revenge of sorts, as a copycat. But at least to Tanaka-san, nothing added up. Not the serial killer explanation as previously mentioned, nor a copycat since, well, the only people to witness the scene were other officers, and they all, bar one, still worked on the force, most of whom at night during the time the murders were being committed, and the only one that didn't work there anymore had unfortunately passed away not long after retirement. There was one explanation though. What Akiyama-san had said to Tanaka-san that night, that he may get his Onryo after all. It seemed impossible, surely, but over many nights of combing the records, in deep discussion and even reading through old Japanese folktales, Tanaka-san, as much as he didn't want to, believed that what they were searching for was not a murderer, at least not a living one, but the vengeful spirit of the young woman. And even Akiyama-san, who usually was stalwart and skeptical about all things, felt in his gut that he had to agree. Since they'd exhausted any and all research they could do, even going back and reopening the files of the murders that they themselves had investigated, they decided to take a more hands-on approach and act preventatively. Getting into their car, the two first decided to check out the apartment from the original crime scene, just as a foundation for where to look next, if there were in fact any connection to the crime. Unfortunately though, upon arrival they found that the building had been deserted and was marked for demolition and redevelopment. Still though, they thought it best to cover all areas, and decided to break in and check the place out. Upon entering from a badly covered up lower window, they shone their flashlights and scanned the main lobby, to which there was nothing in particular out of the ordinary, at least for what one would expect for a derelict building. Agreeing to next make their way straight to the apartment, the detectives soon realized that, unsurprisingly, the building had no power, and so there was no working elevator. So the pair reluctantly made their way to the stairs, which, upon starting up them, was, as you can imagine, unsettling to say the least. After making their way through the cobwebs and occasional rat, and with a few flashlight-induced shadowy jump scares, they arrived on the 5th floor. They made their way past what used to be the older woman's apartment, which, by the looks of some framed pictures and incense in front of the door, seemed as though she'd passed away before the building was closed down. Sad, Akiyama-san thought. She was nice. Nosy, certainly, but nice nonetheless. A few more steps and then there they were. That dreaded apartment, with the door oddly ajar just as it was that awful night. Again, as though mirroring themselves from 10 years earlier, the two nodded at one another, and Akiyama-san swung the door open, with both filling the room with light from their torches. But nothing. Literally nothing. The room was stripped bare. No bed, no fridge, no TV, not even blinds on the windows. It's as though after that night the room was stripped and simply left isolated and untouched. The only thing of note, through the dust and detritus of a decade of emptiness, were the stains, all over the floor where the bodies had been, even where the bed had been, as though the blood had completely soaked through and pooled beneath. Then, while staring at the morose red stains, the ears of both detectives stood on end, as they heard a bizarre scraping from outside the window. Tanaka-san hastily rushed over to witness the source of the noise. Looking down into the alleyway that ran behind the building, a woman, likely quite young, in a long raincoat, dragging what appeared to be a large stainless steel knife across the brickwork of the building. Quickly exclaiming to Akiyama-san that they might well have found their culprit, Tanaka-san ran full force towards the door and began down the stairs leading out. Akiyama-san shouted at him to slow down and go as a team, but he was already too far away. And while himself rushing as fast as he could, all Akiyama-san could think was how he hoped his partner would be okay until he got there. Well, that and that he really needed to quit those damn cigarettes. Finally back on the ground floor and entering into the lobby, Akiyama-san raced toward the door that led out to the alleyway, where he could already hear his partner shouting from, ordering the woman to stand down and drop her weapon. At the door now, a horrible realization hits the detective. As he goes to open the door, he finds it jammed or locked somehow, even though his partner must have only just gone through it. Ferociously kicking and shoulder bashing at the door, it just wouldn't move. But it was all he could do, since to leave the lobby and go the long way around the building, it would take at least 5 minutes. He continues to kick and shoulder bash the door more and more violently as his mind detaches from his actions, and he's fixated on the exchange outside. Tanaka-san again insisting that the woman doesn't come any closer, and that she needs to put the knife down immediately. Then, calmly, softly, the woman spoke.
Watashi ga kiri to omo.
Tanaka-san, clearly confused by the question, but wanting to keep the woman as docile as possible, replied that yes, of course she was pretty, but again, could she please put the knife down and come quietly? Suddenly, Tanaka-san gasped, and the woman spoke again, but this time, the calm, soft voice of before has been replaced by a gargled, yet aggressive, half almost wet-sounding voice. The only thing Akiyama-san could make out next was Tanaka-san's trembling voice, simply stating, "Angatada," before the whole area was filled with the man's blood-curdling screams. Still bashing at the door with all of his might, yelling out his partner's name, the door suddenly, softly, opened from the other side. The woman was nowhere to be seen, as though she hadn't even been there, not even the sound of shoes escaping on the wet concrete. Tanaka-san, however, was there, laying in a pool of his own blood, lifeless, his mouth cut completely open, with his jaw hanging, resting on his throat, and his dead eyes glazed over in pure terror. A little over 30 minutes later, and Akiyama-san is sat despondent, smoking one of his hand-rolled cigarettes on the side of the seat of his car, while forensics swept the area. He'd already filled in his superior officer on what had transpired, down to the very last detail, but unfortunately they weren't buying the Onryo theory, nor that the door magically locked and unlocked, and certainly not that Akiyama-san had heard Tanaka-san express that he seemingly knew who the perp was. They assumed, of course, that it was Tanaka-san acting hastily, and getting himself caught alone with a clearly volatile and unstable individual. This understandably left a quiet but burning rage inside of Akiyama-san. Not only were his fellow officers dismissive and assuming that he was simply misremembering due to stress, like some rookie, but they were almost insinuating as though Tanaka-san had brought this on himself. Akiyama-san was placed on paid leave following the incident until he'd completed a course of therapy and passed a psychological examination to determine if he was fit to continue to serve. While he had stayed quiet about his true feelings on the matter, this silent anger had left him defiant, determined to discover what had really happened and what the reason for all of these senseless murders was. He didn't even care if it cost him his job, or if it cost him even his life. His partner was dead, and he was going to solve this once and for all. For Tanaka-san. Over the following weeks, Akiyama-san revisited the alleyway, as well as all the other sites where the bodies were found, but there was no sign of the killer returning. He'd even taken to, let's say not exactly legally, using his police badge while suspended, to track down and interview prospective witnesses, since so far no one had come forward. This mostly came up empty, as expected. However, there were a few exceptions. There were a small handful of people who claimed to have at least overheard some kind of commotion during the time of the murders, all of which exclaiming that they thought nothing of it at the time. But after hearing the screams and with the revelation that it was widely believed to be the work of a serial killer, they'd been too afraid to come forward. Understandably, they didn't want to be targeted next. Of course, Akiyama-san understood this, and furthermore, he didn't even care. He just wanted to know what the hell they'd heard. Every story was the same. A young woman's voice asking if the victim thought she was pretty. A fairly innocuous question. The victim, likely not wanting to be rude, replied that yes, of course she was. But that's when things took a darker turn. The seemingly soft-spoken voice of the woman became gritty and violent and gargled, shouting if they still thought she was pretty. Then in every single recounting, the individual being asked would simply sound petrified, with all but one stuttering yes, followed by an awful voice replying, and in the one instance that the victim screamed no and yelled at the murderer to get away from him, the voice didn't reply. It just sort of yelled in what sounded almost like distress. But for the victim, nothing changed, and they still met the same fate. This was only slightly more information than Akiyama-san already had, and it didn't answer any more of his questions, although he at least felt somewhat vindicated that others had heard what he had heard, and all of them without exception were convinced as he was that the suspect was otherworldly in some way. With continued vigor, Akiyama-san spent several more nights going from alleyway to alleyway, searching and waiting, sometimes until sunrise. But nothing. No luck, if that's the right word for it. That was until one night, at around 1 a.m., walking through yet another alleyway, he heard a scream coming from several streets away. Hurriedly throwing his cigarette to the ground, he began as fast as he could to the source of the scream, quickly pulling out his phone and calling his superior officer directly. Answering the phone and, in an annoyed tone, wanting to know what Akiyama-san was doing, he explained in between gasps of air that it was happening again, that there was screaming, before matter-of-factly spitting out the address and hanging up, not ceasing to run as fast as he could the whole time. Finally he reached the source of the sound, another badly lit back street, with nothing but the back doors to some closed shops. There was, clear as day, a young woman with long dark hair, parted in the middle and covering her eyes, a surgical mask around her face and a long trench coat, buttoned up and covering her whole body. Laying lifeless in front of her was a middle-aged businessman, likely coming back from a night of drinking with his colleagues, with the same grin sliced into his face. Blood pooled and sprayed everywhere, yet the woman was untouched by it. She just sort of stood staring at Akiyama-san, not a hair out of place, gripping the same large kitchen knife. She stepped lightly over the deceased man and walked as though floating on air until she was stood all but 6 feet from Akiyama-san, before stopping suddenly. All these thoughts running through his head, asking her to stand down, asking her why she was killing these people, who she was, and why Tanaka-san. But before he could gather his thoughts, she spoke. Suddenly, as though being pulled back from his thoughts by some intense wave of will to see this through, he remembered what Tanaka-san had said to the woman, what the other witnesses had reported hearing the other victim say. So as logical as ever, Akiyama-san uttered, "Watashi wakarani?" This stunned the woman, in a very literal sense. She just stood, staring, hazy-eyed, and even with a medical mask, the look of confusion was unmistakable. Akiyama-san, considering that this might be his best chance, reached into his pocket to grab his set of handcuffs, secretly hoping that they'd work if she really was, well, a ghost. When suddenly the woman's trance-like state broke. Angrily screeching, she proceeded to rip off her medical mask, revealing her own gashed-open face. The elastic of the lower portion of the mask now removed, allowing her entire jaw to fall to her throat. It was her. It really was. The woman from 10 years ago. Somehow returned as some kind of phantom to punish others with the same fate that she had encountered. Then, just as she had with the others, her mouth unmoving, the sound of her voice gutturally fell from her throat. This is where Akiyama-san became quite possibly the luckiest man in Japan. The shock of this had caused him to carelessly yank the handcuffs out of his pocket. The handcuffs that were snagged on a box of his filters that he used to roll his cigarettes. This caused the box to fall to the floor and scatter the contents all over the ground. Suddenly this ghoul became transfixed, dropping to its knees and methodically counting each and every filter, as though utterly compelled to do so. And as sheer chance would have it, The sound of screeching wheels pulled up on the pavement behind a bewildered Akiyama-san, quickly followed by the voice of his superior officer ordering the woman to drop her weapons and come peacefully. Akiyama-san began retracting his steps back towards the cars of his fellow officers, allowing them to see in full view the undead, slit-mouthed woman. In abject horror and almost without hesitation, the officers began firing with a mixture of terror and disgust at whatever this creature was. The bullets, though, seemingly passed straight through her, hitting the brickwork behind. But while not damaging the apparition, it broke its concentration from the incessant counting. Looking up with a wild fury, it let out one final goosebump-inducing scream before running, half transparent at inhuman speed towards the other end of the alleyway, before finally disappearing entirely. Akiyama-san was now not only still alive, but validated in what he had seen by almost half of his department, and ironically, it was his smoking habit that had kept him from being murdered. His only regret was that he couldn't apprehend or dispel the being. The tale of the slit-mouthed woman died down in the local area after that night, and the murders ceased entirely in that area, although every now and then the occasional story will surface of someone encountering her. Whether they live or die depends on who tells the story, but what answers you give affecting her disposition seem to change from retelling to retelling. With these tales now coming from all across Japan, one thing is clear. Should you ever bump into a strange woman at night who asks you if she's pretty, simply say that you don't know, and then run as fast as your legs will carry you away to the nearest populated street. As for Akiyama-san, not much is known either, except that he was allegedly reinstated soon after that night. But no records show him currently active in police service, and his records in general are hazy at best. Some say he moved on to a different prefecture, wanting a fresh start from all the horror. Others say he took early retirement and settled down to live peacefully in the country. But who knows? Maybe he writes anonymously on the internet to warn others of the dangers of the slit-mouthed woman. For Tanaka-san. And that's it for today's spooky installment, everyone. If you enjoyed it, remember to like, subscribe, and if you really want to ward off any undead ghouls, show that little bell notification icon some love too. It'll really help the channel. Also, if you have any suggestions for future videos, let me know in the comments, or on my Reddit account, which I'll link in the description. And as always, everyone, take care, and don't stray too far from the path,
lest you end up in the broken expanse.